In 1868, two brothers from Austria-Hungary arrived in Cincinnati, Ohio, took one look at American bread, and saw a business. Within a few years, Charles and Maximilian Fleischmann were selling a small foil-wrapped cube that promised to do the one thing bread had always fought you on: rise on command, every single time. It worked, it made them rich, and it quietly buried a method that ordinary people across Britain and Europe had relied on for the better part of 1,000 years. A method that cost nothing, came straight out of your own kitchen, and produced a lighter, sweeter loaf than the one you are probably eating right now. Here is the part the Fleischmanns left out of the advertising. That cube was an old trick wearing a new label. They took something families had made at home for centuries, scaled it up inside a factory, and sold it back to them at a markup. The original was replaced on purpose, for profit, and today almost nobody remembers it ever existed. It is the year 1200, somewhere in an English market town. A baker is at work before first light, and a few doors down, someone is brewing ale. To us, those look like two separate trades. They were not. They were one craft split in half, and every morning a single living ingredient passed between them. When you brew ale, something rises to the top of the vessel, a thick, pale churning foam, alive with bubbles. Today we would call it yeast. The medieval brewer called it balm. The word comes from the Old English beorma, and for most of English history, balm and yeast meant exactly the same thing. There was no separate product on a shelf. Yeast was the scum you skimmed off beer. One period dictionary defined it flatly as the foam rising on fermenting malt liquor, used as leaven in bread to make it swell. So the brewer skimmed that foam off the top, washed it, and the baker stirred it straight into the dough. It was loaded with active yeast, fresh off a live ferment, and it raised bread faster and lighter than any sour starter could. That is the entire trick. The leaven for the bread came out of the beer. And here is how little anyone understood what they were actually handling. Medieval English bakers had a name for that active foam. They called it God is good. God is good. They had no concept of a microorganism, no microscope to see one, no idea that the froth was alive in any literal sense. All they knew was that this strange substance made dead dough rise and bread swell in the oven like a small daily miracle. So they thanked God for it by name right there in the kitchen and got on with the baking. The version you have heard that sourdough is the timeless original and everything else is a modern shortcut is not the whole picture. Sourdough is older than this by thousands of years. But somewhere in the Middle Ages, across much of Europe, balm began pushing sourdough aside for everyday baking. And it did that for a reason. Balm was better at the job. A sour starter is acidic and slow. It tangs, it drags, and it makes you wait. Balm is a hit of fresh, vigorous yeast, scooped straight off a live ferment, so it works fast, and it leaves the bread sweet instead of sour. It gave a lighter crumb, a milder flavour, and a quicker rise. And it asked almost nothing of the baker, because somebody in the house was brewing anyway. You did not maintain a temperamental culture for weeks. You walked over to the ale, and because somebody was always brewing, the leaven was always ready. There was no window where your culture might be too young, too old, or simply dead on you. The bread's reliability was borrowed from the beer's constancy. This was the prestige method, by the way. Balm made the finest bread in the country, the white, light loaf the wealthy paid for, while the poorest bread leaned on coarser grain and older techniques. Lightness was a luxury, and balm delivered it. The Romans had noticed the same effect centuries earlier. When they pushed into Gaul, into what is now France, they were struck by the bread the Celtic locals were eating. It was lighter and sweeter than what they were used to, and the reason was the local habit of leavening dough with the foam off fermenting drink. The balm approach was already old when the Romans wrote it down with surprise. There was one catch, and the English language still carries it. Balm was alive, and alive means unpredictable. A batch could be strong one morning and feeble the next. Bread could surge or collapse with no obvious reason. That unreliability is exactly where we get the word balmy. It started as a word for something frothing and full of balm, then slid into meaning erratic, then a little bit mad. Every time you call something balmy, you are borrowing a baker's complaint about yeast that would not behave. For a long stretch, none of this was under any threat. The arrangement simply held, and the reason it held is that ale was everywhere. Brewing in medieval England happened almost constantly, woven into ordinary domestic life, and it was carried out mostly by women, the alewives and brewsters, who were among the very few medieval women with a trade of their own. Ale soured within a few days of being made, so it could not be stockpiled. It had to be brewed again and again, week in and week out, in homes and alehouses across the country, which meant fresh active balm was almost never more than a household or two away. So in a great many homes, the same hands that brewed the ale also baked the bread, and the balm never had to travel further than the next room. Where brewing was its own business, bakers and brewers lived in a tight partnership. The beer quite literally fed the bread. The connection ran so deep that the law itself treated the two as one system. The assize of bread and ale, set down in 1267 under King Henry III, fixed the price, the weight, and the quality of bread and ale together in the same statute, as though it were obvious that you could not regulate one without the other. Some surviving recipes go even further, calling for ale to be worked straight into the dough alongside honey, so the loaf carried the brew inside it twice over, once as leaven and once as liquid. To the medieval mind, bread and beer were two ends of a single craft, and it ran deep enough to leave permanent marks on food we still eat without thinking about it. In Ireland, there is a fruited loaf called barmbrack, from the Irish bear in breek, the speckled loaf, traditionally raised with balm and tied to Halloween fortune-telling. In Lancashire, the soft round roll called a balm cake still carries the name to this day, even though almost nobody ordering a bacon balm at lunch realises they are asking for something named after beer foam. The English were so attached to balm that it turned into a matter of national taste. The British wanted the light, sweet loaf it produced. The French wanted the opposite. Up until 1670, France actually banned the use of balm in bread by law, defending the sharper, more acidic flavour of the old sour leaven against the upstart yeast off the ale. Two countries, one narrow channel of water between them, passing laws over which living culture was allowed inside a loaf of bread. That is how central this ingredient was to ordinary life. And almost all of it is still recoverable. The loaves, the leavens, the heritage grains medieval bakers used are not lost to history. They have been pieced back together. If you want to bake this history instead of just watching it, that is what the Medieval Bakery Collection is for. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for building and keeping a living leaven of your own, the way these bakers did. And the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find the right heritage grain. It is all over at the Medieval Way store. By the 1860s, the ground was already shifting under all of it. For the first time, science was about to explain the miracle, and in explaining it, take it apart. Around the middle of the century, the French chemist Louis Pasteur established what that frothy balm actually was. What the bakers had thanked God for turned out to be a colony of living single-celled organisms, feeding on sugar and multiplying in the foam. That was real, useful knowledge. But the moment you can name a thing and put it under glass, you can isolate it, standardize it, and sell it. The mystery had just become a product waiting to be manufactured. In 1883, a Danish researcher named Emil Christian Hansen, working in the laboratory of the Carlsberg Brewery in Copenhagen, did exactly that. He isolated a single pure strain of yeast and worked out how to grow it on its own, clean, separated from the wild mix of organisms that lived in real balm. A single organism, predictable and controllable. It was a genuine scientific achievement. It was also the beginning of the end for God is Good, because once you could grow pure yeast in a lab, you no longer needed the beer to get it. And something real disappeared in that move, even if nobody noticed it at the time. Wild balm was always a whole community, many different strains of yeast, plus the bacteria that rode along with them, all interacting, all feeding flavour and behaviour into the bread that a single clean strain simply cannot. Hansen's pure culture was tidier and more predictable, and in stripping the leaven down to one cell, it stripped out everything else the old foam used to bring to a loaf. The control came at the cost of the complexity. The real story, though, is what happened to the partnership between the brewer and the baker once that became a business. And here is the part that still does not sit right. In 1868, two brothers from Austria-Hungary, Charles and Maximilian Fleischmann, set up a yeast plant in Cincinnati, Ohio, with an American partner named James Gaff. Charles had been unimpressed by American bread, and he had brought over a Central European method for producing yeast in compressed cakes. In 1876, at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, the brothers ran a working Vienna model bakery in front of roughly 10 million visitors, handing out fresh bread raised with their compressed yeast. It worked spectacularly. Within a generation, the American baker no longer skimmed a live ferment. The American baker bought a foil-wrapped cube off a shelf. Now look closely at what that cube actually was, because this is the detail the tidy version of the story leaves out. The Fleischmann's early compressed yeast started from the same place balm always had. They made it by skimming the heavy froth off a grain brew of corn, rye, and barley malt over a 2-day ferment, then pressing that froth into a block under hydraulic pressure. It was balm. It was the exact medieval trick, the foam off a brew, scaled up inside a factory and stamped with a brand name. They did not invent a new way to raise bread. They industrialized the oldest one, packaged it, and sold it back to the people who used to make it for free. You almost have to admire the nerve. The Fleischmanns went further than selling a cube. They built an empire around teaching America that this was the only modern way to bake. Their compressed yeast spoiled within a few days, so they pioneered fast distribution networks to rush it out while it was still alive. They gave away promotional cookbooks. They opened model Vienna bakeries in city after city. A method that had been free, domestic, and nameless for 1,000 years was turned into a branded product with a marketing department behind it, and slowly that brand became the very definition of how bread is supposed to rise. And somehow it got worse for balm specifically. At the same time, what people drank was changing. Lager, brewed cold with a bottom-fermenting yeast that sinks to the bottom instead of rising into a thick skimmable cap, was booming, helped along by the spread of refrigeration. The traditional ale that threw off a generous head of balm was losing ground to a beer that simply did not. So the old household supply of leaven was drying up at the precise moment the factory cube arrived to replace it. Put all of it together, and what you get is a quiet execution carried out from 3 directions at once. The pure lab strain made wild balm look unreliable, which it sometimes was. The factory cube made it unnecessary. The shift to lager made it scarce. And the 1,000-year marriage between the brewer and the baker, the bond that had fed entire towns their daily bread, was simply severed. The beer and the bread went their separate ways, and they never came back together. You would think someone would have fought to keep the older method alive. Almost no one did. The clean cube won on pure convenience, and the win was total. By the early 20th century, industrial baker's yeast was the default leavening across the entire Western world, and during the Second World War, it got a dried, shelf-stable version that did not even need refrigeration. The conquest was finished. Step back and the timeline is almost hard to believe. Human beings baked leavened bread for thousands of years. The packaged baker's yeast that nearly everyone now treats as normal, as simply how bread is made, has been the standard for less than 150 years. It is the new thing wearing the costume of the old thing. It is worth being clear about what got traded away in that deal, because it was not nothing. You lost a leaven that was effectively free. Balm was a byproduct of beer you were already brewing, so the thing that raised your bread cost you nothing extra. The cube turned the leaven into a line item, something you now buy forever. You lost flavour, because a single strain bred for speed and shelf life cannot give you what a living culture of a real ferment gives you. And you lost the lightness and the sweetness that made balm bread the loaf people actually wanted in the first place. What the industry sold as progress was, underneath, a narrowing. A rich, living, local process flattened down to one dried organism in a packet, optimised for the one thing a factory cares about, which is consistency at scale. And consistency is fine. It is also the least interesting thing a loaf of bread can be. The bread medieval bakers prized was prized precisely because it was alive in a way a dried packet can never quite manage. But the method itself never fully died. It just went quiet, and it is still recoverable, which is the part that should bother you a little. You can still raise bread with balm right now. If you brew at all, the foam on top of an active ale ferment is the same living leaven a medieval baker would recognise on sight. Skim some off, stir it into flour and water to build a sponge, let it work, and bake. If you do not brew, the cloudy living dregs at the bottom of a bottle-conditioned beer, the kind with real yeast still sitting in it, will do a gentler version of the same job. British bakers and food historians have been quietly reviving this ale balm method for years now, precisely because the bread it makes comes out lighter and sweeter than a sourdough, carrying a depth of flavour that no foil cube has ever managed. It is slower than tearing open a packet. It is less predictable than a lab strain. That is the entire point. You are working with a living culture pulled from a live ferment, the way bread was raised for most of its history, instead of a single domesticated organism bred for nothing but speed and a long shelf life. So think back to that kitchen from the start, the starter that needs feeding, the dough you watch for hours, hoping it does not give up on you, that whole anxious ritual that modern sourdough culture sells as a return to the old ways. It is not the old way. For most of the last 1,000 years, the old way was a brewer handing a baker a cup of living foam and bread that rose by dinner time. We lost that method for a simple reason. A clean, fast, profitable cube made it look obsolete, and 1,000 years of brewing and baking as a single craft got quietly written out of the kitchen to sell it. The bakers who once thanked God for that foam would not recognise a dried packet of yeast as the same thing at all. In a way, it is not. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the buried, deliberate, infuriating kind, subscribe and stick around. Next time, we are taking apart another staple you think you understand, and the older method that got erased to sell you the modern one.